Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress, and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stewart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for maximum enjoyment, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 22, Renewing Resolve, Stealing the March, when scarcity sparks substitution and impels innovations asunder. In the previous episode on Schumpeterian Renewal, Ash set the stage for a new age, for a new phase in our exploration of innovation and progress. In these 10 episodes, we'll be discussing some of the foundational elements that have likely had an even more tangible and relatable impact on our modern lives. Compared to the previous ones already covered, so much so that we tend to identify many of these as part of a classical age that defines who we are or what we aspire to. Let's start materially.
When breaks beget breakthroughs, it's day one of the Iron Age, and introducing Irene, our new friend. Irene is irate that with the end of the Bronze Age, which as we saw in episode 20, likely hastened by the increasing scarcity of tin after the breaking down of trade networks, meant that bronze has become hard to make. But in a twist of irony, we can't start the Iron Age without irony, can we? So in a twist of irony, it won't be Irene who shall invent iron. That honor shall be Steve's. Remember Steve from the Stone Age? Let me explain. You know Steve was retired from action after we moved on to the Bronze Age, his place taken by Brian, as a sign of the times and as decreed by the goddess Altera. Hey, don't you wish there was a goddess of alliteration? And then also Bruno and Brenda, per the same decree. But when I was looking to retire these folk, after the end of that era, I was confronted by the association of fictional characters who protested vociferously, with placards saying things like,
Respect genuinely fake characters. Don't fake with us. For fake's sake.
So our bronze-atastic friends and even Steve have now been issued fictional immortality passes, so yes, they're back. Slightly more seriously, I found some of you enjoying, perhaps even taking a fondness to the recurring characters, so I decided to keep them and continue the tradition in my series to often start with a bit of fictionalization to illustrate useful points as relevant. So back to the story. Given Irene's ire of the soaring scarcity of bronze, Brian and Steve resolved to do something about it. It has been known of this other inferior material, iron, which is much harder to make because the temperatures required are significantly higher than bronze, and with the best of efforts, they just get this half-melted mass, which they have to beat to shape, and quickly too, because that's right, you have to strike when the iron is hot, literally. But now, given the current state of affairs, this is all they have to work with. They do the standard thing. They take the iron ore and heat it in a furnace using charcoal. And then they get that spongy, half-made blob, technical term, the bloom, which they have to beat all day to remove bits of unwanted material, slag, and bring it to shape. And it's still quite soft, nothing compared to good old bronze from the good old days. It's annoying because even as they're sweating away doing the constant beating of the molten thingy, they can hear Irene and Brenda in the background, gossiping away, with Irene's cat Iris giving them looks of, "You're a bunch of amateurs." And then comes in Bruno, our trusty tail wagster, and you guessed it, he wants to play stick fetchy. Despite initial refusals, as you saw he was susceptible to in episode 16, Brian gives in to those big puppy eye pleas. But Steve is like, wait, we still need to pull out this blob from the furnace to shape it, damn it. But our boys end up going outdoors for a much-needed break, secretly thanking Bruno for it. And later they come back, and lo and behold, some parts of the bloom are much harder than both the other parts, and than bronze. A much-needed breakthrough indeed. That's when Irene looks at Steve and remarks,
Steve, have you just invented a new material? Let's call it Stevel.
What time hath wrought?
Iron on its own, as we mentioned, is not good enough. The key inventive step here is discovering under what circumstances iron can be transformed into something harder, and this, not unlike fictionalized above, happened at some point when metallurgists stumbled upon a chemical process we now call carburization. The gist of it is that when the iron ore in the heated furnace comes in prolonged contact with charcoal, the iron absorbs a certain amount of carbon to develop hardness, anywhere from about 0.5% to above 2%. You've likely heard of carbon steel. especially if you've been out shopping for a good wok or similar sturdy kitchen equipment. And that's what transformed the whole iron business. So yes, in another twist of seeming irony, the Iron Age was made possible by steel. Another important historical point to appreciate is what I've hinted at. Iron was known in the ancient Near East in what we officially call the Bronze Age. It is said that iron working in that region started in around 1500 BC in Anatolia, presumably closely guarded by the Hittites as a state secret. There is this famous story of an iron dagger found in Pharaoh Tutankhamun's tomb going back to the 1300s BC, called King Tut's dagger, which, given there was no evidence of iron metallurgy in Egypt until about the 600s BC, has been surmised to have been a gift from the Hittites or even the Mitanni kings, but the matter is not settled. However, and it's not hard to imagine, with the drying up of avenues of making bronze, which we have seen in detail in episode 14 as requiring the import of the rare component tin from faraway lands such as present-day Afghanistan or Cornwall in Great Britain, finding viable alternatives to bronze became imperative. So despite the difficulties mentioned above, by way of furnace temperature demands or the need to work the iron to shape it, iron soon began to emerge as the age-defining metal in the Near East and Europe. However, that's only part of the story. The best is yet to come.
The breath the dragon cast.
East Asia, in particular, China achieved a metallurgical breakthrough that eluded the West for over a millennium: the production of cast iron. The iron making we saw in the above context required, as I said, working it. The iron thus obtained is wrought iron. Wrought is just another form of saying worked. That's how far things got in the West, in what's seen as the classical age based on iron. In China, however, metallurgists achieved such improvements to blast furnace technology that they succeeded in obtaining the much higher than bronze temperatures to fully melt iron, thus being able to cast it, given a certain composition, into molds, just as nicely bronze had been cast everywhere in the past. The key technical breakthrough here was the development of sophisticated bellows systems powered by a double-acting piston that provided continuous airflow to attain and sustain such higher temperatures, which were far superior to the Western leather bellows.
Crucible's crucial craft.
But there's even more to the grand story of iron and steel. This was neither in the Near East nor the Far East, but in between, in the Indian subcontinent. The exact technical details will take up a lot more space, but I'll condense it here at the expense of making it too simplistic. If you are a professional metallurgist, this is the time to take a coffee break. While the Chinese achievements allowed them to cast iron into molds, this also meant that the carbon content tended to be too high. We can associate the problems with this with our own valid connotation of cast iron. It's brittle. The Indian subcontinent, or South Asia, has had a long history of iron metallurgy that's been traced back to 1500 BCE or more, with many elements of the process having developed indigenously. Let's go to South India, not South Asia, but specifically the southern part of the peninsula, traditionally also called the Deccan. So yes, let's go to South India, to the region around Mysore where this was perfected, to examine the most spectacular of these innovations, the invention of wootz steel. Around 300 BC, South Indians developed the crucible process, which crucially identified the right metallurgical procedures: sealed crucibles, thermocycling, controlled cooling, etc., additive elements, carbon-rich organic matter such as bamboo, certain types of leaves, trace vanadium, rice husk ash, and consequently the ideal composition to obtain a type of steel with superior properties compared to the East or West. This includes a very hard, composite steel, lacking impurities, needing much less working at relatively lower temperatures, and other more specific properties of such true hyper-eutectoid steel. This wootz steel, about 6 centuries after the above date, made it to the West, introduced into Europe via the Syrians and thus known as Damascus steel. But it wasn't until the 1800s that Europeans, thanks to initial work by people like British inventor Benjamin Huntsman, June 1704 to 1776, it wasn't until the 1800s that Westerners obtained an understanding of this 21-century-old South Indian technology.
The exorable metal of progress.
Unlike, say, bronze, I don't have to make the case for iron and steel being ultimately the same material, in a spectrum of what it's composed of. They are still part of our imagination. We instantly associate this material with strength and might and durability. In the early 1900s, an ambitious Georgian named Jugashvili, who would go on to attempt to, and perhaps succeeded in becoming the most powerful leader in the world ever, would give himself the name Man of Steel. Later on in the century, others from his regime would mock a British Prime Minister's resolute ways by labeling her the Iron Lady. Look up the footnotes for more detail. Taking a longer-term historical view, the Iron Age that it heralded represents a significantly more democratic technological revolution. We have seen how bronze was the preserve of the elite. It depended on sourcing a rare material from distant lands and was very much restricted to the upper echelons of society. Iron, by contrast, a material more abundantly available, and within the constraints mentioned above, still workable, allowed for a different trajectory of human progress. It allowed for a far more widespread ownership of metal goods and tools, military participation, and economic participation. Iron plowshares allowed for the cultivating and settling of less hospitable land than before. Iron led to the emergence of new cultures, such as the Celts, with their ornate traditions in Central Europe, who at this point in mid-last millennium BC, they were still en route westward. Iron is correlated with the founding and later the emergence of Rome as the supreme power of the Mediterranean and Europe more widely. And thanks to such greater widespread access to using iron weaponry, as evidenced by the emergence of the hoplites, citizen soldiers of the ancient Greek city-states, we might even have to attribute to iron that quaint and seemingly anachronistic Athenian experiment in expanding political participation and choice to a wider section of society beyond the elites, democracy. But we have more lessons to learn, or at least questions to ask ourselves in our pursuit of understanding innovation and progress. We have traced three independent or semi-independent technological threads of evolution in the development of this age-defining material spanning 3 or 4 continents that effectively make up Eurasia. The developments in the West were widely embraced, but were limited in some technological aspects compared to the other two. What's better, getting it all right or using it wider? In the Far East and China, there were some superior technological achievements, but the overall growth and diffusion was stifled by state monopolization and control, weren't they? And then in the South, in India, again, there was early flowering of innovation, and the early achievements having been embedded in the soon-to-become rigidly hereditary professional castes, while leading to specialization and intergenerational transmission. Also again stifled further broader innovation, thanks to the lack of cross-pollination and social mobility. The lesson I gather is that a certain trajectory of technological or institutional progress is not a given. Heck, even progress itself is not a given. It's something that will, or may, result when we all choose to apply our best efforts to build something incrementally better. What is the lesson you draw from all this?